I odmah se izvinjavam da će biti na engleski, ali moj srpski nije baš najbolji i nisam siguran, mislim kad pričam o naučnim stvarima, mislim baš ne znam sve riječi i tako će biti radionica na engleski, ali mislim vi ste to znali i probat ćemo. Mislim, neću da idem duboko u teoriju, neću da pričam nekako previše engleski, probat ću pravo da svakoga, kako se kaže na njemački, ne znam na srpski, da ponesem sa sobom i da malo svoju teoriju što imamo da predstavimo. Sad u prvom dijelu ću da pričam o svom doktorskom radu. To sam ja počeo u svom doktorskom radu da jedan teoretski koncept subjektivacije koji se mora u empiriji da vidite već počinje, moje riječ mi fale, pošto zato će biti na engleski, a drugi dio onda kad počnemo onda će biti pravo na radionica. U toj radionici imam i tekste iz medija, ćemo malo zajedno da radimo i onda ćemo na kraju imati, to se već vrlo radujem, imat ćemo 3 prezentacije, bit će Justina što je iz Helsinkija došla i sad je uskoro počela da radi sa sociologijom znanja, sa tom što će ja ovdje da predstavim, zato se puno radujem, mislim, čitao sam tvoj tekst i pravo je bilo super i bit će jedan primjer kako se taj program mora u empiriji da se vrši s tim. I onda ćemo imati još 2 druge prezentacije, da se ne znam jesu već tu. Monika mi se izveći, Natala, što? Vi ste tu, super, onda ćemo se malo kasnije da upoznamo, još nismo imali primjer da pričamo. Vrijeme nam trči, neću puno da pričam na početku, sad će biti na početku, mislim možda ja da se predstavim, ja sam iz Univerziteta Augsburga i radim već 2012. sam doktorirao i moj profesor je, što sam mi tekst ponio, Rainer Keller, on je taj jedan u Njemačkoj najpoznatiji koji je taj program izradio i mi imamo u Augsburgu veliki diskurs kontekst, imamo jednu žurnal for Discourse Studies, to ću sad malo reklamu da pravim. Ako vi radite nešto o diskursu, slobodno morate nam na engleski tekst da šaljete. I sad prije nego što počnem i prije nego što prebacim na engleski, hoću još da se zahvalim. Prvo hoću da se zahvalim profesorki Ivana Spasiću koja je to omogućila. Mi smo se u martu upoznali, ovdje je bilo Discourse.net Congress i odmah je bila otvorena prema toj ideji i pravo se zahvaljujem da ste to omogućili. I Tamari i Ani se zahvaljujem, mislim bila je super organizacija, sve smo se nekako super dogovorili, ja mislim da će to biti dobra radionica. I vama što ste došli, što imate interes, isto puno hvala, mislim to me pravo iznenadilo da se, mislim, kurs na engleski, sociologija znanja, da imate interes i da ste došli puno. Okay. Now we'll switch into English and I hope it will get better. So for my first part, I want to talk about new developments in discourse research, and I specifically want to talk about my research on subjectivation processes. And this is a concept, like I already tried to say it in Serbian, this is a concept that I developed during my PhD. And I had a research on semi-skilled workers and how semi-skilled workers who are working in factories, normally in automobile factories, how they are or how their self-relations are situated in discourses. This was the main question. But before I start, let me explain you how the subjectivation analysis and discourse research, how they are connected. And the initial point for my work was a kind of dissatisfaction with discourse research in general. Because discourse research and the governmentality studies, everybody who was working with Foucault always had the assumption that discourses have a real strong influence on human subjectivities. Yeah? Maybe you know, this is my title, maybe you know it was the governmentality studies that Ulrich Bröckling does it in Germany, Niklas Rose has done some research in the UK, and they are all talking about, and that's what Foucault told us, that we are all entrepreneurial selves, that the neoliberal discourses are forming a subject, a new type of subject, and that's the neoliberal subject, and now we all have to be an entrepreneurial self. So they are assuming that there is no way out, there is no way of resistance, and we are all, like, when we try to resist, the discourses just get us, and we can't escape these discourses. And I was dissatisfied with this perspective, because I was asking myself, did ever somebody do some research on that empirically? Did somebody ever talk to some individuals and try to research how they're situated in these discourses, or if they are not? And I really was trying to look for studies who've already done it, and I was surprised when I started in 2007 with my research that there weren't any studies like trying to reconstruct if the entrepreneurial self has actually an influence on real, living, acting, embodied people. And so my first step was this dissatisfaction, and I was trying to think of a model, how I can research how discourses and living people, embodied people are connected. So, because when you looked at the sociology of knowledge approach to discourse, which I will be talking about, when you look at other discourse approaches working with Foucault and sociology and others, there's just a slight idea how they are connected, but it wasn't enough for me to do a real, actual empirical research. So I had to build up my own methodology to start the research, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So, the entrepreneurial self, there's a lot of self-help literature. You can also, that's what I found on the web, if you're not an entrepreneur, you can do it, you can have courses, and do you see it? Yeah, there's also a phone number, so if you want to have a course to build up your entrepreneurial self, there are lots of studies analyzing this. So this is just for the beginning. What I will be talking about now. In the first step, I will outline the methodological groundings for analyzing subjectivities and self-relations with the theoretical framework of a Foucault-orientated discourse perspective. And Scat, that's the sociology of knowledge approach. So discourse is a really ugly term, you know, so I will be talking about Scat. And I'm not going too deep into this because we will have a workshop on Scat, so I will just outline the subject-centered theoretical assumptions that I need to present you my empirical findings in the third part. In the second part, I will argue that it is necessary to classify what processes take place when people are being addressed by and when people refer to discourses. And this is what I'm going to call it, or what I'm calling self-positioning. So then let me begin with outlining my Scat-based methodology. Scat, as you will see later on, is a research program that situates Foucault's concepts of discourse, of power, and dispositives in the American pragmatist tradition of sociology, the Chicago School of Sociology, symbolic interactionism, and the German or European tradition of the sociology of knowledge. And we will discuss the implications of this bringing together later, but so far I'm just like focused on the decentered subject, what is really important for the methodology I build up. So regarding Foucault's conceptions of the subject, it becomes clear that he has been misunderstood. I think he has been misunderstood insofar he's associated with having proclaimed the death of the subject. So this death thesis is often underpinned by referring to Foucault's The Order of Things, and the famous quote that the human subject may disappear like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. So according to Foucault, the subject is an invention of the modern age, and if the arrangements of knowledge or of power knowledge change, then the subject might disappear. So what I want to point out is that Foucault, of course, denies the empathic understanding of the subject. The subject isn't an autonomous or sovereign instance. in the sense of enlightenment, for instance. But nevertheless, Foucault's interest in the subject can be compared with the classical sociology of Max Weber. Weber was studying the historical process of the social construction of knowledge about the subject and the possible impacts of these symbolic orders on the actual subjectivities of the embodied individuals. Weber was studying, maybe you know, the Protestant salvation messages and how these salvation messages, mainly in self-help literature, have influenced people's everyday living practices and how this was situated in and pushing forward a capitalist formation of society. So I think Foucault and sociology, they are really close together, and in terms of proclaiming the death of a subject, I think it is possible to use Foucault or to read Foucault as a sociologist. That's what I'm trying to show you now and the rest of the day. For me, Foucault is a historic, like we talked just a few minutes ago, it's a historic sociologist. So, I have a quote that underscores what I think there are similarities to Weber, and that underscores my idea of what the decentered subject is and why it does fit to sociology. It's a quote from the History of Sexuality, Volume 2, and it goes like this. What are the games of truth, by which man proposes to think his own nature when he perceives himself to be mad, when he considers himself to be ill, when he conceives of himself as a living, speaking, laboring being, when he judges and punishes himself as a criminal? And I think here we can see the main idea. It's the games of truth, which I highlighted. This could be understood as social practices of discursive construction of symbolic orders, and Foucault's historic analysis of madness, of the penal system, of sexuality, was centered around the question how the life sciences, the so-called life sciences, have constructed specific subjects, mostly within division practices of normal and deviant subjects. You are a pervert or you have a normal sexuality. You are a criminal or you're not. This is what Foucault was doing in his historical analysis. And these truths have an impact on the self-relations of humans. That's the main basic idea, and I think it really fits well into what Max Weber did with his Protestant ethic thesis. So, since Scat, the Sociology of Knowledge approach to discourse, is integrating many ideas from Michel Foucault, the research program is focused accordingly on the investigations of the constructions of symbolic orders. Scat aims to analyze the discursive construction of reality at a meso level of institutions, organizations, and social actors. In other words, the focus of the Sociology of Knowledge approach to discourse and other discourse studies, it's on the games of truth, and not on the living, embodied human individuals. So this focus on the truth and knowledge regimes is not only typical for Scat, also for other research programs. And in contrast to other approaches using Foucault's conceptions, Scat emphasizes the importance of an actor concept. And this is something I will be talking about in the second and third part of this workshop. So I won't get into it very deeply. Actors and discourses are related in mostly two ways. There are other ways, we will be talking about it, but mostly in two ways. First, actors are occupying so-called speaker positions or speaking positions, and by occupying them, they produce discourse in a more or less creative manner. Second, actors are interpellated by these discourses. They are addressed by these discourses, and that is, discourses seek out actors and constitute their identities. And this occurs in different ways. And for example, through the production of subject positions like the entrepreneurial self. That's something I will come back to later. Now, looking at the other side, Looking at the other side, so to say, looking at on sociology, there is a lot of criticism that they are centering their analysis on the individual and on the interaction perspective. So in other words, most of these empirical studies of self and subjective self relations do not go beyond the micro perspective of an actor. I know this is not true for Bourdieu, there are a lot of other, but when you look at the symbolic interactionist perspective, it's really, really focused on this micro perspective. And Adele Clark, she also published in 2005 her situational analysis, which I can recommend, which is really a great book. She has some, we will be talking about it later. But Adele Clark did something similar what Rainer Keller did from the American context. She was like bringing together Anselm Strauss and the grounded theory tradition with Foucault's thoughts of discourse, because she also was dissatisfied with this micro perspective, and she was arguing that we have to broaden our perspectives on human self-relations. And with regard to analyzing identities and subjectivities, she points out that we and the people and things we choose to study are all routinely both producing and awash in seas of discourses. So we have to take into consideration when we are analyzing human subjectivities that it's not just the classical factors like race, class, gender, the milieu that influences the subjectivity, but in a postmodern society of spectacle, like Guy Debord said it once, in such modern societies, most of these classical factors like race, class, gender, and so on are also mediated through discourses. So we should, just to broaden our perspective, or it would be a good idea, like Adele Clark puts it, to broaden our perspectives, to use discourses as a resource of how our identities constructed in discourses. And this was a perspective also missing in the symbolic interactionist tradition. So, considering this in the Scat frame of reference, subjectivation is a two-sided process. We have on the one hand subject positions, and these subject positions are understood as identity templates or role expectations, if you want a more classical sociological vocabulary. And these identity templates or subject positions are generated in discourses and seek out addressees. On the other hand, these subject positions are also instructing those addressees to shape and change the self in certain ways. But you have to keep in mind the process of actually shaping yourself is not determined by the discourses. And this is a central question what we have to be talking about later. Quite the contrary. If you take the actor concept of the sociology of knowledge, or the actor concept of the symbolic interactionism, human actors are more or less free when they are adopting or referring to subject positions. And in a Foucauldian sense, more or less free means that individuals and groups are never just passive or reactionary forces in the powerful games of truth. If it were so, Foucault says, power wouldn't be needed in the first place. If we weren't free, why should there be all this power, like discipline, like biopolitics, biopower? So, drawing from a sociological perspective, it is clear that possible reactions to interpellations have a wide range. And this is just a few I've listed here. You can adopt the subject positions, you try to adopt them affirmatively. You can adopt it in parts. You can, and that's what's happened most of the time, you misinterpret the subject positions you are addressed by. Or what also happens, what I could see in my sample with my working class guys, they just ignore the discourses. They've never heard of them, and so you have to take into account that discourses maybe are not that powerful because they meet subjects which the subjects have a power of their own. So the focus, because of this more or less agency that actors have, the focus always should be on the resignification processes that take place. That's one thing that Judith Butler Butler is underscoring very, very much. The resignification processes are very, and they don't have just to be like in Butler's work, subversive. I think they can be creative in a lot of different ways and not just subversive. Yeah, but we can talk about that in the discussion. So, this is the basic method. These are the basic methodological assumptions. Now I come to my model, which I developed in my PhD, what's called self-positioning. What do I mean by that? So for me, when I looked through other approaches, like Laclau-Mouffe, like Judith Butler, Foucault, and other post-structuralist approaches, everybody was talking or was using the notion identity when they were speaking about what is happening on the level of the actual embodied subject. But everybody was just using the term identity, nobody was clarifying what it is. And for me, I gained the idea to take this notion and to situate it in the American pragmatist or the American sociologist tradition of the symbolic interactionism. So, Goffman and George Herbert Mead are my main references here, and each conceptualized identity as an ongoing process. And this fits well into the perspective of a decentered subject, which we have with Foucault. Anselm Strauss put it in Mirror in Masks, like this: identity and human conduct are open-ended, tentative, explanatory, hypothetical, problematical, devious, changeable, and they have only partly unified character. Yeah? This is my understanding of what is going on the level of the actual living individuals. Mead had also shown that the self is a social structure in that sense that it is developed in interactions, and that communication processes which are based on significant symbols are used to construct ourself. Our consciousness is always bound to these significant symbols in the universe of discourse. And despite all the differences that Mead, Butler, or Foucault's ontologies might have, I think they are compatible insofar as they imagine an inner space as an instance of self-reflexivity which is bound in some way to some outer symbolic orders, to materialities and time and space relations. So this was my starting point, and I now will go further into deeply with what Goffman was arguing. Goffman, for instance, he was arguing that groups, institutions, and organizations confront individuals with identity expectations. Goffman points out that the participation in social situations is always tied to identity expectations and not just role expectations or behavioral expectations. So you can say that social situations are not just characterized by their prescribed activity, but also by their prescribed being. And I quote Goffman, "Now if any social establishment can be seen as a place where implications about self systematically arise, we can go on to see it as a place where these implications are systematically dealt with by the participant." And my question is, how is it dealt with? So further, I want to point out that individuals are also being identified by facts like gender and race, by personal facts like our looks, or the stories we tell about us. And Goffman says that people attach these facts around us like candy floss. And I didn't know what candy floss is when I read it in English for the first time, so I looked it up in Serbian. It's šećerna vata. Znači, identiteta je nešto što se lijepi oko nas, malo ili više. Because we are identified all the time, in all situations. Herbert Blumer, another famous, the symbolic interactionist, he also showed that we are constantly being identified by groups or as members of groups, like religious groups or ethnic groups. And Blumer, he had this already in 1950. Blumer emphasizes in his concept of group positioning that this process, do I have it? Yeah. Blumer emphasizes that, this is the concept, that this process depends not so much on the life world face-to-face interactions, but on the public discourses about the groups. So maybe you know the contact hypothesis when it comes to right extremists. Just in Germany they say, oh, they just have to go to meet some Turkish people, to eat some Turkish food, and then they won't be so xenophobic anymore. No, it doesn't work. I mean, many research have shown it doesn't work because the images we get about the Turkish people in Germany, or maybe the refugees, it's not just from our life world, face-to-face interactions, it's from TV, it's from the images we get. Yeah? I have often the experience in Germany that people start, oh, the foreigners, I don't like them. And I say, hey, I'm a foreigner too. And they say, oh no, I don't mean you. You're a nice guy, but I mean the others, you know the others. I mean, which others are they? And this is the others represented in the symbolic orders. So, to quickly summarize, I suggest of speaking of self-positioning processes when identity issues are at stake. We are constantly being positioned by groups, by organizations, by institutions. We are being positioned in our professional life, in our private life, and we are being positioned by subject positions and identity templates which exist and proceed in discourses. These numerous processes of identification and identity expectations surround us in almost every sphere, and they exert a certain degree of pressure for adaptation, as I have called it. And this positioning pressure, however slight it might be, forces us to react in some way. Either we do accept the identity expectations, we ignore them, and so on. Or we choose a middle way, like Goffman had it with his concepts with role distance. Yeah, we accept the expectations. Yeah, for instance, you have the expectations that I'm a serious speaker and I speak in a scientific language, and I accept these expectations, but just insofar that I can also show you by making jokes, by stepping aside, that I'm not just this serious speaker, that I'm also an individual. This is the middle way how we can adapt to the expectations that are drawn upon us. So, to put a point to it, I argue that subjectivation can be understood as a positioning process. At the discourse level, actors are being positioned by identity templates, and on the level of the actual self-formation and the subjective self-relations, I underscore the fact that the adaptation of subject positions or whatever kind of reaction to discursive constructed identity templates is a permanent, continuous, precarious, tentative, dynamic, and ongoing process of self-positioning. And with this understanding in mind, I will now turn to my empirical data and try to demonstrate how these heuristics that I developed could be applied. So, since time is running short already, I will just say a few words about my sample. I've conducted 20 interviews with unskilled workers. They were like working for 20 or more, even more years in factories, like doing every day the same routine work. Yeah, this was a classical male worker in the factory. And for the first step, I had, this is my idea how it should work. In the first step, before I did the interviews, I had done research on what are the dominant subject figures in the discourses of work, the discourses of qualification, and what are the dominant subject figures. And as you may know, they are, we come to my empirical findings, there is, in Germany, I'm not sure about other contexts, but in Germany there is one hegemonic discourse, it's we are a knowledge-based society. And if you're not qualified, you don't have any chance to find work. Maybe you can work as a temporary worker, or you can just be unemployed because we don't need your qualifications. And as a semi-skilled or unskilled workers, you are marginalized through these discourses. because in all discourses you're being positioned like somebody who's not worth anything, or who's not having any chance to participate on the labor market. And this is the way they are marginalized through discourses. They are also marginalized in the life world. We had a big deindustrialization process in Germany with the globalization. The low-skilled work was like transferred to the low-wage countries, like to Romania, Hungary, and stuff like that. And so this once very, very proud group of people, this proud group of workers, now have a really marginal status, not just economically, but also in the discourses. There was also a decline of the working class culture, and so on and so on. On the other hand, we do have the dominant subject positions in these discourses. And I think, because really the time is running short, I'm not going into this. Maybe they are known for the most part of it. The entrepreneurial self, the creative self, and the flexible self. These are the three main subject positions that are reconstructed in the discourses. And I think they explain themselves. Don't have to go into it. And it also, for me, seems to be clear that these three subject positions cannot be reached by the workers. The workers are far away from being flexible. They are working like 20 years in the same factory. They are far away from being creative because their boss tells them exactly what to do. And they are even more far away from being an entrepreneurial self. So, let's see, what will my workers do in such a situation? How do they position themselves in the world? And one outcome of my findings was that the entrepreneurial self and the flexible self was not a position my workers are taking. I mean, that's not really surprising. But for the flexible self, there are indications that the identity templates from these discourses do have a kind of impact on the self-positioning of my workers. But the question is, what kind of impact am I talking about? First of all, maybe just a few words what I think, or what I don't see as an indication for an actual subjectivation process. I didn't search my interview transcripts for specific keywords. Maybe I was looking like, okay, did he say flexibility? Did he say I'm flexible? And then I'm going, he said he's flexible. Now I have the proof that he's being subjectified as a flexible self. I think this would be too easy. Or not just too easy, it wouldn't be right, because I think subjectivation processes are really complex processes, a complex dealing with what is expected from me and how do I relate to myself. So from my methodological standpoint, it would be a misleading understanding of subjectivation. Bearing on the methodological groundings I outlined, I think a sign for an actual subjectivation would be if the self-narratives, the things they tell me, have remarkable similarities to the qualities and attributes processing in the subject positions in the discourses concerning flexibility. Now, let me demonstrate this with my empirical materials. I had some of the workers, and they were telling me throughout the interviews, Sasha, I can do this, I can do that, I worked everywhere here. Yeah? If somebody is ill, I just jump in and I can do his job. Yeah? But at the same time, when I looked objective, I really spent the day with my workers. I saw they're just in this one place and all the jobs are quite similar. But when they were telling about themselves, they were not saying, I'm flexible. They were just telling me stories about what they can do here, that they can do everything, that the boss needs them because they are really here. In my interpretation of this, they are presenting themselves as flexible. Yeah? One of them, or some of them, were telling me, Sasha, it's good not to have an apprenticeship. If I had one apprentice, if I had a finished apprenticeship, I could just work there. With my thing, what I've done in my life, I can work everywhere. Yeah? And this is my interpretation, but I have to make it more plausible that there is an influence. So how can I make it with the data, like Anselm Strauss said it, you have to show it in the data, how can it make it more plausible? The first indication is the similarity of the storylines of the self-narratives, like I already told. They are presenting themselves, they are presenting their selves, that they are able to adapt to new demands, they can work extra hours, and all these narratives are, or all these attributes are in the discourses of the flexible self. And the second reason, and that's, I think, a more important reason, I had another group of workers. They were doing exactly the same job. They had similar family lives. They had, from a Bourdieuian perspective, they would have the same habitus. It's the same group of workers. But they were telling completely different stories. They were telling me, Sasha, excuse me, I can't tell you anything interesting because my job is so boring. It's so easy to learn. One of them said, Sasha, it's so easy, even you could do it. Yeah? And so why are the workers on the same workplace with a similar family lives, with a similar habitus, are telling these completely different stories? My interpretation is that this group of workers, or first of all, I have shown in my research that people can use different resources to make sense of their situation. One group of my workers, they have a real withdrawn life without any other interest than the near social environment. They were just talking about their house, the garden, the children. That's their world. When I asked them, for instance, about their future, Sasha, I can't tell you anything about that. Yeah, they just lived like really, really a withdrawn life in their small houses, like in a cage for me, it seems. But it's a different story, what I think. The other group of workers, who positioned themselves, as my interpretation, who positioned themselves as flexible, they were more open to the demands of the world at large, which for instance means they were very active in unions, they want to talk to me about the current crisis, they want to talk about unfair wages, they want to talk to me about greedy managers, useless politicians. Yeah? They had clearly allocated more resources to present themselves. This is an indication. But normally in this context, before you criticize me, I will criticize myself. Normally I always hear two critiques in that context. One critique is like, maybe Sasha, they presented themselves in a way they thought I expected it. And I think, of course, I'm representing the social order. Of course they are. I mean, for me, that's not a problem. That's when I started interviews. You have to realize that this is an interaction situation, and you are representing something. People want to tell you a story. Often they say to me, Sasha, please write this down. Yeah? They thought I'm writing a book about them, you know. Of course, I know that. But for me, this is an indicator how somebody wants to be seen, what seems sayable. Yeah? How is he perceiving the normative order? How is he normalizing himself? So this is for me not a problem. This is, people would say, yeah, it's just identity politics or face work, but yeah, I think face work and identity politics are a good indication of how somebody wants to be seen. And it hasn't to be in a strategic way, like he's not an actor, he can, like I talked 1.5 hours, I spent the day with them, he can't act all the day. And it's not a strategic way of positioning, but it's a way of positioning that he thinks it's possible in front of me, or it's necessary in front of me. So my answer, my answer to this problem is that it does not matter if it is true or just a fake self-presentation. They are telling me something about how they perceive themselves. So in the end, my explanation of this kind of self-positioning is another one. I assume that the workers do know about their precarious situations as a semi-skilled worker. And not just through public discourses, but also through the downsizing processes they experienced in their companies. They all have seen like many workmates being replaced by temporary workers or just lose their jobs. So that's my interpretation, so they position themselves as flexible to feel a kind of security. I call it, I don't know if I translate it good, I call it a fictional security strategy, this kind of self-positioning. By that I mean that the workers do know what the labor market demands, and that is to be flexible, because you can hear it everywhere. And nowadays, today, you need to be flexible in all senses of the word. And these discourses of flexibility are absolutely dominant. And with the self-attribution of being a flexible subject, they are able to feel secure not to lose their jobs, at least to some degree. So to my very short conclusion. My findings indicate that individuals from the same milieu and with a very similar habitus, with the same workplace, and even having similar family lives, nevertheless can have different ways of positioning themselves as laboring or working beings. So by embedding the subjectivation heuristics in the Scat framework, I argue that this subjectivation has to be understood as a complex positioning process. In this respect, I do insist that it is misleading to speak of subjectivation in cases where researchers just make simple comparisons of discourses and interviews, find matching keywords or something like that. In such cases, the researchers are analyzing how people refer to discourses or in what way they do that. But the subjectivation concept embedded in Scat is rather useful when identities are at stake, and when people are being positioned as flexible selves or as responsible selves, as caring selves, as political or sustainable selves. And the concept of self-positioning is then useful in exploring how and if these identity templates in discourses do actually influence human selves and subjectivities. And so to close with Adele Clark, like it or not, she writes, we are constantly awash in seas of discourses. And if I may add, as my research concept follows the footsteps of Scat, and Scat is following Foucault, I want to underscore that the so-called decentered subject needs to be integrated more deeply in our empirical research. And I hope that my heuristic concept of subjectivation can be understood as a move towards a broader perspective on the discursive situatedness of human subjectivity. Thank you, Juana.